Alright, so this would normally be the part where I do some sort of creative montage to the music of the game, throwing text on the screen with my overly ponderous and vague thoughts to sort of drag you into the new video. But come on, we've done that twice already. It's the third episode, and you already know what I'm about. We're a month into this game and this series, and both are equally awesome. No need for any of that fanciness. We've got a lot to talk about. Also, a quick reminder that this series is not spoiler safe, along with all of Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild. Here's a list of the games that I'll be showing visuals of. Nothing other than minor visual spoilers for the other games, but I know some of you are pretty spoiler sensitive, so I definitely want everyone to keep this in mind. We're tackling combat in this section. Combat was a huge part of Breath of the Wild, and remains so here in Tears of the Kingdom. I've been looking forward to playing with the combat in this game basically since the announcement. Combat was a ton of fun in Breath of the Wild, but it was extraordinarily flawed. Does Tears of the Kingdom have what it takes to fix what was broken? Let's find out. Hi, my name is Volcarinite, and it's time for the third episode of our Tears of the Kingdom review series. Today, it's Chapter 2, 1,000 Cuts. To begin our section on combat, I'd like to take some time to look at the combat systems from Breath of the Wild that haven't been hugely overhauled, and that's a surprising amount of them. All of the creativity of Breath of the Wild's combat, unique arenas and situations, environmental manipulation, options in taking on enemies through traditional combat, all of that still exists. From a mechanical standpoint, this is a good thing. There's a few small quality of life tweaks on top of this mechanically rich baseline. One thing I didn't really mention in the Breath of the Wild section was my opinion on the durability system, and that's because, well, I don't really have strong feelings towards it. What the durability system did for Breath of the Wild is that it took a universal utility in most action games, damage output, and made it into a resource. Here's what I mean. You have a collection of weapons in your inventory. Those weapons have two traits, a damage value and a durability value. You can multiply those two numbers to get a weapon's total damage potential. For example, right when you wake up on the Great Sky Island, you get the Decayed Master Sword as your weapon. It does a measly 1 point of damage. You can swing it, say, 15 times before it breaks. I don't know if that's the precise value, and you do need to use some of that durability to break vines and environmental objects, but go with me here. So you have 15 uses of 1 damage, meaning the Decayed Master Sword has a total damage potential of 15. Later, you'll pick up a wooden stick, which deals 4 damage per hit. This is a little beefier and lasts maybe 25 hits, meaning it has a total damage potential of 100. Fine, you get it. Boring math over. You continue to collect weapons throughout the game. You eventually have half a dozen or so different weapons, each with different values for damage and durability, and you have a fair bit of total potential damage you can deal. But crucially, that number is not infinite. One of the many things that you have to consider whenever you face a camp of enemies or a big boss baddie is how much damage you can deal. There's a chance, especially early in the game, that careless use of weapons in a fight will get you into a position where you can't win. There's a chance that you don't have enough damage even with optimal play. It's taking a fundamental mechanic that most players wouldn't think about and turning it into a resource. Now, the concept of turning a fundamental tool of a game into a limited resource is, to me, extremely compelling in theory. It's why, in Celeste, the core is my favorite level. You're taught to think of your movement as an all-purpose tool throughout the game, and then have that stripped away and are forced to manage it as a resource. Incredible stuff. But in Breath of the Wild, this never really got developed. Because durability and enemy health are both values that were kept hidden from the player, it was never really possible to rely on resource management techniques. You only got a vague sense of how durable weapons are, and though you could wear a specific piece of gear to display enemy HP, it's not exactly super accessible. But the larger problem was that it didn't take long before you easily had enough damage to take out basically all enemies in the game. It was only in the early game where this was a concern, and when it was a major issue. Certain foes were entirely impossible to fight until you spent more time collecting weapons. And once you had a steady stream of weapons coming in, this problem pretty much faded into memory, relegating the durability system to just cycling through your weapons menu in the middle of combat encounters. I don't have an opinion on this system because I really like the concept, but really dislike the execution, leading to a weapon system that fails to engage me but also doesn't really intimidate me. It ends up just being a thing that you have to pay attention to occasionally in combat, just like healing. Healing also is mostly the same as Breath of the Wild, but I don't don't feel quite as neutrally towards it as I do towards durability. The ability to pause your game at any time and to consume as much healing as you can carry, which can be a lot, means that damage isn't really a punishment. It just forces you to cycle through your inventory and eat, bringing you back up to full health without really affecting combat. I hate this. I thought this was a pretty cheap way of implementing this kind of healing. It meant that unless you restricted your own play, you could never die. Many people wanted the durability system of Breath of the Wild to be overhauled or reworked, but not me. I wanted this health management to be completely rebuilt. This hasn't happened. I do feel like Tears of the Kingdom makes consumables and food a little harder to come by, meaning that you probably won't be carrying around dozens of full heals in your inventory. This is especially true for hearty foods, which, when cooked by themselves, will fully heal you. I think everyone who played Breath of the Wild frequented the Sheikah Tower in the Farron Rainforest in order to get the 24 or so hearty durians here to cook for full heals in an instant. But now, hearty foods are much rarer. The other small thing that Tears of the Kingdom adds to this is the way that oogly boogly damage works. When you're in the depths and take damage either from oogly boogly in the world or from a monster infected with it, those hearts can't be healed by regular foods. You do eventually find some consumables that reverse this, but until you do, taking damage is much more permanent. This is good. It means that mistakes feel punishing down here in a way that they don't on the surface. But aside from these smaller patches, the majority of the system remains identical. Healing is something that you have to pause the game and shuffle through your inventory to access. And with the hugely increased amount of stuff you collect in the game, this can be even more time consuming than it was before. This was a big disappointment. It seemed to me like it wouldn't have been that hard to implement a more thoughtful healing system that means health isn't just something that you can access whenever, but a small risk. Maybe pressing down on the D-pad while locked onto an enemy could have you eat the meals in your inventory in order, triggering a 1-second eating animation that prevents you from sprinting or attacking. It's not a perfect idea, sure, but it incorporates healing into the combat in a way that simply doesn't exist right now. The last thing I want to talk about in this section is armor upgrades. In Breath of the Wild, I was never shy about upgrading my armor as much as I could. This was always pretty easy since rupees were easy to come by and all of the resources I needed for the upgrades were usually just stuff that was uselessly piled into my inventory. But armor upgrades quickly squashed what little difficulty could be found in combat, meaning that taking hits was almost inconsequential aside from the fact that some hits knocked you over. Tears of the Kingdom did modify this system a little, but it was hindsight that made this system work for me. Tears of the Kingdom sort of helps this by making rupees a bit harder to come by, thanks to lower prices for sellable objects and encouraging the use of all of your resources. You probably won't have as many rupees lying around, and those monster parts that are required to upgrade your armor are also very useful for other things, so you'll probably be waiting longer to upgrade armor. But I simply didn't bother. I took 2 upgrades on most sets to unlock their special set bonus, meaning that my defense stat was hovering at around 25 points for basically the whole game. This honestly felt perfect to me. Combat was still risky and challenging, but I wasn't ever getting one-shot by a surprise strike, even late in the game. Playing through combat this way made it immensely more fun than plowing through enemies without consequences ever did. Now, it's not perfect, and the desired experience of fighting enemies will be different for every player, but being able to have different armor sets with different buffs and defense stats is a pretty good compromise, and even though it did exist in the last game, being able to keep it in mind for this game made combat much better. Okay, I think that takes care of what stayed the same. Everything else is either the same but was great in the first game, like unique arenas and world-based combat situations, or we'll talk about it later in this video. Well, actually there's one more thing that's largely the same in both games, but it's a much more complicated issue, for me anyway. Nothing harmed Breath of the Wild's combat more than needing to sort through your inventory at every opportunity. This issue was insidious and unrelenting, weaving its way into every aspect of the game. From in-combat weapon switching to failing to gather contents from chests, the inventory system continuously provided an irritation and a disincentive to engage in combat. Even though I didn't really talk about it much in the Breath of the Wild section, it was this need to trudge into the menu at every opportunity that I wanted fixed more than anything else. More than the enemy variety or greater boss challenges or anything to do with the durability system, the game needed less inventory management. Tears of the Kingdom does not have less inventory management. It has more, much more. Now you may be struggling to see why I'm talking about this issue, or at least why I'm talking about it in the combat section. See, combat in most action games is made up of a dance, a series of moves that you and your opponent make towards each other in order to reach a conclusion. You need to deal enough damage and miss enough of your opponent's strikes to defeat them. You're building up a kind of momentum in combat. This is easy to see in some heavy action games that are all about this kind of combo building momentum. Here, look at Astral Chain for an excellent example of this. You're faced with a ton of foes, some big and bad, others fodder, and you build up combos and speed in order to be able to play the game. You need to beat up everyone you see here. There's no other option, so you buckle down and begin building your combos. Of course, you don't always win. Sometimes you get trapped and stuck between enemies or simply can't get started yourself. In these situations, it's the enemies that are building up momentum for their own combos and strikes. As they do, as you get weaker and your health drops, it becomes harder and harder to claw back your own momentum, to get yourself back in the fight and to come out victorious. Either way, it's all about momentum. Yours, your opponent's, then yours, then your opponent's again, back and forth until someone becomes too strong and dedicated to lose. Every action that you make has a good result, dealing damage, but also a cost. In a Souls-like game, that cost is your stamina or equivalent, but that's not really relevant here. For most games, the cost is one of time and movement. You have to move forward and your attacks take time. Both of these things can, potentially, leave you more vulnerable to being attacked by your enemies. They're trade-offs that you have to mitigate as you play. Now, this is all familiar in Tears of the Kingdom. Sure, it doesn't have the mechanically ingrained combo system that a pure action game might feed off of, but you're still doing the same sorts of actions. The different types of weapons handle differently, so you do have to learn a little bit about how each one works, but it's more about the movement and threat management. This is all great fun, to be sure. Whenever I'm in combat encounters, feet on the ground and eyes forward, it's as fun as it was in Breath of the Wild, but this comes crashing down all the time. We talked a little bit about how I wish the healing system had been rebuilt from the ground up. The main thing that I wanted to see changed was the way that any healing forced you into the inventory, pausing combat and requiring you to fiddle with a menu screen to activate your healing. Most action games with healing options inflict a time and a sort of focus penalty on you as you heal. Healing takes time in the combat encounter, and you can't really do anything else while you heal. This is what I suggested. Healing is a risk, but so is not healing. Again, it's something you have to learn and decide so that you can keep building momentum and not lose it to your opponent. But Tears of the Kingdom doesn't have this penalty for healing. Healing is something that is essentially infinite if you want, which is not true in most games, and literally pauses combat encounters in order for you to fiddle through your inventory. So all of those carefully managed risk-reward systems that have already been working well in other games are gone. Your momentum is gone too, since you can't affect anything in the world while you're in the healing screen. It's just sit there, tab over to your tomatoes or whatever, and click A until Link shoved them all down his gullet hole to get back to full health. The weapon durability system has the same problem. Most action games have you using a selection of different weapons that handle differently, and this is good. It allows players flexibility and choice in play. Tears of the Kingdom's different weapon types could have been used similarly, but because they break, it's not always possible to reliably have one of a certain type. Again, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's something that you have to manage. The problem is that every time a weapon breaks, you have to go into your inventory and pick out a new one. This may seem like a small problem, but imagine for a moment that you're fighting an enemy that requires a heavy blunt weapon, like a talus. These kinds of enemies that really require weapons with a specific trait, are much more common in Tears of the Kingdom, which is an excellent addition. But as you're fighting this talus, your hammer breaks and you need another one. So you have to open up your weapon wheel and search for a weapon with those traits, a task which pauses combat and takes 5, 10, 15 seconds in the middle of a fight to complete. It forces you out of the moment, out of the combat encounter, to muddle through a menu. Or even something as simple as collecting new weapons. How did you feel whenever you got to a chest in a shrine or just out in the world and excitedly opened it, only to see the message, your inventory is full? Again, the game is forcing you into the inventory screen just to deal with this problem. Now, Tears of the Kingdom doesn't have a solution to the healing menu screen. I thought it would be pretty easy, as I talked about earlier. I don't know exactly what the solution for your inventory is full would be, though I know that the little interface that allows you to drop a weapon on the spot is not good enough. Maybe the option to break down weapons into basic resources? I don't know. But the game does try to fix that last issue, switching weapons and weapon types. It does this by adding a player-initiated function to transform your weapons and to give them more durability whenever you want. It's called Fuse, and I've never been more conflicted on a game mechanic. Now, fuse is an interesting mechanic on its own. Some people thought Breath of the Wild was missing either a crafting system or an experience system. I personally wasn't looking for either one of these, but these were valid concerns for people who didn't feel incentivized to get into combat. Some enemies were worth fighting because they had particularly strong weapons, while others were nothing but a waste. Breath of the Wild tried to combat this by allowing monster parts to be used in upgrading armor and cooking elixirs, but it didn't really work out. Elixirs were outclassed by meals, which used resources that could be found peacefully and plentifully, and armor upgrades were each only a one-time investment, meaning that once you fully upgraded the sets of armor you wanted to use, that was it. Never fight a bokoblin camp again. For me, this meant I found myself setting a tribal medallion just north of Death Mountain to fight the 2 golden Lynels that made their home there. I'd grab their bows and spears and swords after every blood moon, and use those to simply stomp whatever enemies got in the way of my exploration. Once I had the tools to defeat those Lynels, combat was essentially over. Fighting the Lynels was interesting the first few times, but over time, combat becomes less of a challenge and more of a nuisance. In theory, the Fuse rune in Tears of the Kingdom fixes this. The raw weapons that most enemies hold, as well as basically all the weapons that you find throughout the world, have low durability and low damage output. Even at the end of the game, I still found myself regularly picking up weapons with 8 to 10 damage at the most. This means that throughout the game, enemies are holding the same level of weapons. The Savage Lynel swords from North Eldin or the Royal Claymore sticking out of the skull south of the Lost Woods back in Breath of the Wild aren't there. Instead, you use Fuse to combine those base weapons with monster parts in order to craft the better weapons that you need to beat better enemies. Killing monsters always gives you the monster parts that are useful to making better weapons, giving monster parts a clear and excellent use. Along with this, now that the enemy scaling system is more relevant throughout the game, you can visually see weapon upgrades in the world and how slaying better enemies will give you more powerful and more powerful looking weapons. You can always safely invest all of your Black Moblin Horde weapons on this camp that has a couple of silver bokoblins, because your reward won't just be a random weapon in the chest, but access to better weapons in some. This is also a light crafting system, allowing for you to feel more invested in your weapons and adding another gameplay system for you to engage in. And as you craft better weapons, you are able to kill stronger enemies and gather their parts to create better gear that raise your damage output, which is a sort of experience system. It's a smoother curve than in Breath of the Wild because you didn't have these sudden drops in damage output whenever a great weapon broke. Because the base weapons are all pretty similar in damage and all of your high damage resources are monster parts that you can collect freely, you're never really left defenseless. Even a stick, which you can gather from any tree, can be fused into a weapon that's not just usable, but serviceable at any point. This is, on the surface, a great improvement to the strength progression of Breath of the Wild, and an answer to many legitimate concerns. The problem, though, is that every single one of these actions requires inventory fiddling. When a weapon breaks, fiddle through your weapon list to get your new weapon. Oh crap, it's just a stick, I need to make it better. Go into your inventory, hit the sort button until you're sorting by fuse weapon power and drop that resource. Trigger your rune. Wait, no, I'm still on auto build. Gotta tab over to fuse. Then, oh, where did I put that horn again? Walk around until the fuse rune finds the resource fuse. And bish bash bosh, it only took you 4 menus and 30 seconds to switch weapons. This problem is compounded by the way that bows and arrows interact with fuse. In Breath of the Wild, you had your 6 types of arrows. It was kind of a pain to switch between them, but once you did, you were firing that kind of arrow until you changed it up yourself. Not so in Tears of the Kingdom. If there's an enemy that you want to hit with an elemental arrow, you have to go into your fuse menu and select an item to fuse every single time you fire an arrow. The selection stays on whatever you last pick, and the fuse happens without you having to drop the item on the ground, which is all okay, but you still have to cycle through a menu every single time you fire an arrow. I'm even more irritated because there was a really thoughtful and progressive stride already made to make bow and arrow combat better. In Breath of the Wild, whenever you pulled your bow out in the air, your stamina would decrease really rapidly, meaning that any action that takes time in the air would reduce your stamina drastically. Even turning around early on could cost you your whole stamina wheel, but not in Tears of the Kingdom. Now, your stamina only goes down the instant you fire an arrow. Done. Simple as that. This is an ingenious solution, and one that feels amazing, until I have to tab through and sort by most used to get to the fire fruit. It's especially frustrating because this was super easy to solve. Both problems, actually. For bow and arrow, have your currently selected fuse resource continuously applied to arrows until you select something else or run out. Done. Combine this with an easy-to-get crafting recipe for arrows, since you now only have 1 type of arrow as opposed to the 6 types in Breath of the Wild, and you've just made bow combat 4,000% better. It's a little more complicated for melee combat, though not much. I think a few fixes could be applied here. The first is that fuse should be an option that you can access straight from the menu, outside of combat, or the moment you pick up a new unfused weapon in the world. I know that they wanted to keep the thematic element of fuse only working when both items are in the world, but they already compromised that with the arrows. So when you pick up a new weapon or select one from your inventory, you should see a selection of your resources automatically sorted by fuse power increase. That way, the weapons in your bag are already set to use in high-level combat encounters from the moment you pick them up. You don't have to run away from the combat encounters halfway through, drop 6 Lionel horns on the ground, then cycle through your gnarled sticks, fusing them to the horns one by one. As for switching weapons in combat, why not have you automatically equip the next strongest weapon, or maybe the weapon closest in damage or the same type as the one that just broke? If you want to switch to a different weapon, you can, but instead of forcing players to sort through their inventories in the middle of encounters, have it so they're always holding a weapon. Finally, combine this with a visual indication of a weapon's durability. If the idea is to keep this secret from players, this is ruined by the warning message you get. Besides, there's no real reason to keep this information hidden, so some visual indication of how much durability a weapon has seems like it wouldn't affect the feel of this system much. The problem with fuse as a combat tool in its current implementation is that it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. It gives monster and enemy parts more meaning and adds more interactivity to a player's handling of combat encounters during the rest of gameplay, but it drastically increases the amount of inventory fiddling. All of the great experimentation in Breath of the Wild's combat system is still here. Plus, your new runes, the ability to build machines, and all the additional weapons and gear just add to the fun. But it's weighed down at every opportunity by the need to muddle through menus to unlock every single one of these opportunities, every single time. This takes a great system and forces it to grind to a halt 10, 20, 30 times in a combat encounter. Combat in this game takes away its own momentum over and over and over again. Alright, this is rock bottom. This is the worst that combat has to offer, and yeah, it's not great. But it's all better from here on out, and we're about to enter the combat area where the most improvement was made. And that, of course, is enemy variety. Enemy variety in Breath of the Wild was, sadly, very limited. You had bokoblins, moblins, and lizalfos as your primary enemies. Recolored, scaled versions of each, as well as elemental and stall skeletal versions existed for them all, though they were mostly the same designs with modest palette changes. Choo-choos, keese, and octoroks existed as small traps that could be killed in a single hit. Wizrobes played with elements, mini talus monsters also existed. Yiga foot soldiers could ambush you from time to time, and I guess some of the animals around the world would occasionally turn on you to deal damage. It's possible I missed something, but I had to go look at my compendium just to remember some of these monsters to give you an idea of their memorability. That might sound like a fair amount on a high level, but over the course of a game as big and long as Breath of the Wild, it did not take long for this selection to get old and stale. Indeed, by the end of the game, I was thoroughly sick of the basic enemies of Hyrule. I'd seen every combination and every iteration, and I was done. Luckily, Tears of the Kingdom fixes this issue easily. For starters, each of the scaled enemy varieties have some new design differences to highlight the parts that they'll drop. Seeing these changes to their designs made them feel fresh and fun. So did seeing bokoblins carrying around the backpacks of the fruit or resources that they were either collecting or using to attack you. That was just inspired. And all of the elemental, scaled, and stall variations still exist. There are also now some oogly boogly variants, which have the effect of semi-permanently taking hearts from you underground. Being jumped by a group of skeletal oogly boogly creatures that form from the ground can be very startling the first time, and even though their moveset is the same, it's got a much stronger feeling of danger. Finally, there's a handful of enemies that wear a sort of stone armor. Some of the Lynels wear it, but so do many of the bokoblins. These require you to break the armor with a strong, blunt weapon like a hammer or a smasher before you can deal damage to the enemy. This is a fun way to add a bit of bulk to your foes, and it's really cool to see how the designers have adapted the designs of the enemies that we've already met to augment fights against them. Then, for totally new enemies, there were a whole bunch. Let's just chat about a few standouts. The Horoblins were easily my favorite. Something meaty and strong, clambering around the roofs of caves and dropping down to attack you, grotesque and sneaky. These were annoying and tricky in the exact right ways. Being attacked by Horoblins dropping down on all sides of you invoked the exact emotional response it was going for. Arakudas were cool to look at, but a bit disappointing. Another aerial enemy was a great addition, since since Keese were so easy to defeat, but these turned out to just be Keese with a slightly larger moveset. It's cool to see them holding a chest or another enemy, but the fact that they die in a single hit is a missed opportunity. Nonetheless, they're a great addition to the mix of enemies and act as really good natural scouts to camps. Then, the Construct enemies set was a cool take on the Guardians from the last game. The Guardians always felt closer to mini-boss difficulty for me, but the Constructs feel like a great scaling enemy throughout the game. They can use the fuse mechanics and have meaty health bars without overstaying their welcome. They were cool to fight in those Eventide style shrines that took all of your weapons, at least at first. A great suite of foes. There's a handful of other enemies too, but just one more that I want to talk about, because discovering it was a truly wild experience. So I'm hiking around the base of Lanayru Mountain, just by the eastern shore of Hyrule. It's the middle of the day and I'm just about to reach the point where I need to put on my warm clothes when I noticed the sky getting red. I was really confused. I'd just gotten a blood moon and it was the middle of the day. What was going on? Of course, it wasn't a blood moon, and it wasn't something I was prepared for. No, it was a bunch of scary, red, oogly-boogly hands with eyes ganging up and chasing me, leaving oogly boogly in their wake. I ran so far away. I sprinted and climbed as fast as I could, but the hands eventually got me, drained my health, and killed me. This was so scary. It was a moment where all of the fear from the depths leaked out onto the surface, giving me a surprise instant of really high danger. It was excellent. Overall, the new enemies add so much more variety and interest to combat. Between the new implementation of the scaling system's colored enemies giving colored drops and the new enemies, combat stays much more interesting for longer. The way that enemies interact with the arenas that they live in only adds to this. But regular enemies aren't the only group of foes that have had their numbers expanded, obviously. There's one more thing that we need to talk about. Bosses were a fair disappointment in the last game. There just weren't very many of them, they weren't that fun to fight, and they didn't drop anything that made up for what little challenge they could provide, save for maybe the Lynels. More boss types, made more common throughout the world and combined with other enemy encounter varieties, were pipe dreams. All three of these concerns were directly addressed. In fact, I personally believe that boss combat is easily the area where the most improvement in the entire game was made. First though, a quick correction from that section. It turns out that the main bosses of Breath of the Wild actually do scale, and the idea that they don't is a common misconception. A big thanks to the user Trycraft for directing me to a video detailing this fact. They scale in stages based on how many of them you'd already beaten. I'm surprised that I didn't notice this myself, but it's absolutely true. The bosses do scale. I'm not yet experienced enough in the game to tell you precisely how the main bosses in Tears of the Kingdom scale, though I'm sure they do. What I can tell you is that these bosses are way more fun, both visually and mechanically, than the elemental blights of Breath of the Wild. We're not going to break down in detail most of the bosses of the game, since that would take hours, but compared to the 9 discrete types of bosses in Breath of the Wild, there's dozens of different bosses in the new game. We will break down all of the main bosses because they're all visually interesting and have some fun mechanics, though they don't really have the rich challenge that I was hoping for. I still think that they're a vast improvement over those of Breath of the Wild. For each of the 5 dungeons of the game, we have one big boss. Several of them also have some smaller mid-bosses that occur during the quest line leading up to the dungeon. We'll tackle them all, briefly, in the order that I saw them. I started with the Zora quest line, which meant that I first fought the Sludge-like. It's kind of a tutorial to Sidon's Sage Vow, with you fighting a mobile like while managing a sludge that it spawns. You use the water power to clear out the sludge on the ground to make a path to the boss, hit the boss with water to clear it off, then do as much damage as it'll allow you to before you back away and go again. It's very clumsy, almost all the fights that require the Sage Vows are, but it's fine. The Muktarok is the advanced version of it then. It's much faster and more visually impressive, with the weak Muktarok often spawning a huge sludge monster to ride, but the mechanics of fighting it are mostly the same. Next I went to Goron City. Technically, your first fight is the Yunobo clearly not himself fight, which is pretty funny from a story perspective, but basically non-existent as a boss fight. You just wait for him to hit a wall, then smack him around a bit before going again. He's got less health than a mid-tier moblin. Then, you have the most visually impressive and mechanically disappointing non-final boss of the game, Moragia. After learning to use Yunobo's Sage Vow with the minecarts, doing the same on a plane while fighting an enormous dragon monster coming out of the central crater of a volcano was so cool. But it dies as you hit each head once, and that happens way too fast. I really wish it had been a much longer fight with multiple stages, better aim, and air manipulation mechanics that made it harder. It was so cool to participate in that its brevity was hugely disappointing. The Marbled Goma is a big, rocky spider crab thing. It's imposing, though not not as arresting as Moragia, but it's definitely a bit harder. You can use the Sage Vow, though I found it much easier to accomplish with the bow and arrow. After that, it's just a matter of knocking it down from the ceiling and beating it up. A cool boss, though again, I do wish it were a little harder. Then I fought Colgera. This dragon ant serpent hybrid is the main and only boss in the Rito questline. It's okay. It's an aerial fight, somewhat similar to boarding the divine beast Va Meadow in Breath of the Wild. You learn earlier in the dungeon that jumping on the cracked ice will break it, so you have to get above Colgera and destroy its 3 body segments twice, while using the clunky air movement to avoid its attacks. This was very different from the rest since you're not really doing traditional damage, rather you take out its health and set sixths. Sort of an odd boss out of the rest, but, like most of that questline, it's mainly meant to get you used to the mid-air majesty of the world. You're strongly guided towards the Rito questline to be your first, and this is meant to be the first boss you fight, so this kind of makes sense. Next, there's the 2 versions of Queen Gibdo. It's odd to me that in both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, the boss in the Gerudo region was by far the hardest, but here we are again. It's got a wide and complicated move pool in its several phases, being very fast. Riju's Sage Vow was just useful enough here that its limitations are incredibly frustrating, namely having to go to her and activate it every time you want to use it. It's another momentum halting tactic, and it makes what could be a very interesting fight feel very tedious. I want to be running around, dodging the Queen Gibdo's attacks and moving at top speed, but I have to find Riju every time I need to shoot at it. Fusing arrows can help alleviate the need to find Riju, but sorting through your inventory doesn't solve the halted momentum issue. Now, all of the final dungeon bosses we've talked about so far can eventually be found again. In the depths, there's a dozen or so arenas dotted around where these bosses will spawn after you defeat them the first time. They guard some rare loot and drop some strong fuse pieces themselves, so they're worth fighting. Without being forced to use the Sage Vows, they can be a bit better, though I still find them to be kind of slow. Nevertheless, it's a nice option to have, and I'm really glad they included it. Finally, the Seized Construct is my least favorite boss in the game. It's not that it's tough, but I absolutely hate using the Construct as a mech. I wanted to love it because, you know, Mecha Zelda, but it's clunky and slow and just terrible. This fight is kind of like the Top Mania fight in Super Mario Galaxy, where you have to smack it to the electric edge before you can do damage, but this fight is so slow. I really don't like this one. I guess I'll talk about the boss that sort of links main quest bosses to mini bosses, and that's Master Koga. You fight him several times, and each time he's crafted some sort of Zonai destruction machine. You hit him once to knock him off, then beat him up for a moment until he jumps back on. Fighting Koga was always funny, and the retcon of that big pit he fell into from Breath of the Wild being a chasm to the depths was amazing. The fights were incredibly easy, but fun from both lore and light mechanical experimentation perspectives. For mini-bosses, we do still have the Lynels, Talus, Hinoxes, and Moldugas. Many of these also interact with a new scaling system, meaning that the scaled colors have different designs and drop great materials, meaning that the rewards are much better than they were. For new mini-bosses, we're just going to talk about the standouts. There's a specific version of an old boss that I want to talk about, and that's the Battle Talus. This is a version of the Talus that has a small enemy camp on its back. This is positively inspired. It makes so much sense that the enemies of the world would choose to utilize these sentient boulders to help defend themselves. It means that fighting the Talus, which is usually pretty dull, is much more exciting since it's both defending itself and being defended by the enemies on its back. Absolutely fantastic. There's also Gleeoks, which take the cake from the Lynels as the most difficult mini-bosses in the game. These 3-headed elemental hydras make a terrifying return from previous Zelda games here, and fighting them is a challenging mix of precision and patience. I noticed the one by the Akala Citadel ruins first, and was terrified. It took me a long time to best one of these. Flux constructs are more of a puzzle involving your runes than a real fight, but it perfects the idea that Water Blight began in the last time, and I loved every single fight against these. I mentioned the Frogs in a previous section, but these are basically just Moldugas that can't go underground. Then there's these sort of group boss encounters, and these were great. I loved sneaking around Lurelin Village or the Pirate Cove on Eventide and taking out the enemies one by one. Having the boss bar come up at the top and represent the health of all enemies in the entire group made it feel like a real boss fight. Finally, I mentioned the Oogly Boogly hands earlier. Well, these little jump scares pop up at several points around the world, and many of them once defeated, spawn a mini-boss called Phantom Ganon. This is a great way to get the player familiar with the mechanics of the final boss in the game, and the fight is suitably difficult. It's pretty slow, but that's sort of the idea. I liked it, especially when I first discovered this fight underneath the Deku Tree in the Lost Woods. Let's talk about that final boss then. Most Zelda final bosses are a 3-course meal of a light tutorial appetizer stage, the main boss entree stage, and the visually spectacular but mechanically unfulfilling dessert stage. And Tears of the Kingdom's Ganondorf is no different. The first fight is basically a tutorial, though an exceptionally easy one. I'd fought Phantom Ganon at several points already by the time I went underneath Hyrule Castle, so this being basically the exact same fight was strange. I didn't like the sages being present, and having so many of them around meant that using any individual ability was next to impossible. It was kind of suffocating. But then, when the sages were knocked out and you faced Demon King Ganondorf mano a mano, this was amazing. The game's opening cutscene and oogly boogly heart loss mechanic comes full circle here when Ganondorf's attacks don't just gray out the hearts, but actually remove them. The first time I did a flurry rush and he did one right back to me had me grinning like an idiot. And his switching of weapons invoked the feeling of fighting a Lionel for the first time. In fact, lots of his attacks seem to be inspired by the Lionel fight, which is a good fight, but I'd fought many Lionels by then. There's a coliseum of 5 in a row, not to mention that you have to pass one in order to get here, so I found this phase to be very easy too. I cleared both of these sections on my first try, and this was disappointing because the dessert was Ganondorf becoming a big old demon dragon. Then it's the Colgera fight again, except instead of riding the wind, you ride Zelda. It's not really a fight, just a series of skydive targeting tricks. I never liked these final stages of the fight, and that doesn't really change here. Okay, I think that covers everything. Overall, the bosses look and feel way cooler, and they almost always have better rewards to fight. I just wish that a few of them were a bit more mechanically interesting or challenging, because fighting them was just so cool. Now for the hard part. I really hoped that this section would be one that I could simply mark all the way up as perfected, but no. Tears of the Kingdom certainly improves the overall combat experience from Breath of the Wild thanks to more variety in foes and better drops overall, but it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back, because the amount of inventory fiddling required during combat, which was already too high in Breath of the Wild, is way higher in Tears of the Kingdom. As I've been editing these videos, I work really hard to make sure that jarring transitions are kept to a minimum and visual interest is at a maximum. I try to pick segments that have a lot of entertaining visuals but aren't so jerky and disjointed as to be confusing or even motion sickness inducing. And the enemy of this endeavor is the menu screen. 90% of combat encounter video clips that I use in these videos had their lengths determined not by the script or what was on screen, but because that was the longest stretch I could make without interrupting it with the inventory screen or menu. Because every single fight involves at least one, usually multiple, and sometimes dozens of trips to the menu screen. It ground momentum to a halt at every opportunity, from gameplay to video editing, and it's impossible to forgive. What remains is how heavily to penalize combat as a whole thanks to this error. Combat in Tears of the Kingdom gets a B. It's a modest improvement over its predecessor. It could have been great, it should have been great, but the menu screen grated on me over and over again. There's so much good, so much improvement, but when I'm watching it all through the grade gaps between menu elements while searching for my soldier construct horns or Gibdo bones, it's hard to tell. I hope this can be improved in patches, because it actively holds combat back from being incredible. Okay, that's it. I'm sorry if this section felt a little more negative than the previous two, but that's just the nature of combat in the game. I do hope you enjoyed it though. It was a lot of fun to put together, and getting to relive my experiences in playing this game to you guys is always really exciting for me. I hope you agree. A quick bit of housekeeping. As I detailed in my channel update video a couple weeks ago, I'm working on my Pokemon North and South project in the background. I've currently got a submission form open for Fakemon designs, so if you're interested, check out the end of that video for details on exactly how you can submit your designs to me. And that's just about it. We'll be tackling puzzles in Chapter 3, which should be out in another few weeks, but that's all I've got for you today. So enjoy your day and take care.